The door hadn't finished opening before the soldier spoke. Not to the attending. Not to the charge nurse who'd been running Ridgecrest General's emergency department for 9 years with the particular authority of someone who had never once been told no and had stopped expecting it. Not to anyone visible, really. To the woman in the corner who was counting gauze pads and hadn't looked up yet. "We're looking for Wren," he said. "They told us she'd be here." The ear went quiet in the way that large, loud spaces went quiet when something entered them that didn't belong. Monitors kept beeping. The overhead PA kept murmuring. But the human noise, the overlapping voices, the rolling carts, the particular low-grade chaos of a Tuesday morning at Ridgecrest General in Lethbridge, Alberta, dropped out all at once like someone had pulled a wire. There were 6 of them, full tactical gear, desert-worn, rifles at the low ready. Behind them a gurney moving fast, 2 more soldiers running it, one performing compressions mid-stride. The man on the gurney was large and gray-faced and very still except for the work being done on his chest, and his left side had been packed with a field dressing that had long since stopped doing what field dressings were supposed to do. "We need Wren," the soldier said again. "Right now, Doctor." Sanderson, who had been the attending on duty for 11 years and wore that tenure like a second set of shoulders, turned from the nurse's station with the expression of a man who had just been addressed in a language he didn't speak. Charge Nurse Darlene Mack, who had run this department with the particular iron efficiency of someone who had never once questioned whether she was the most important person in any given room, looked from the gurney to the soldiers and then to the rest of her staff with the expression of someone waiting for a translation that wasn't coming. The woman in the corner set down her clipboard. Her name was Simone Beauchamp. She'd been at Ridgecrest for 7 weeks. She worked supply rotation, restocking, inventory, the work that kept a trauma bay functional and that nobody particularly noticed until it wasn't done. She was 32 years old and had a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of Lethbridge that she'd furnished in an afternoon from a combination of what came with the place and a single trip to a second-hand shop. She owned a French press, a pair of good running shoes, and a bookshelf she hadn't filled yet. She walked out from behind the supply cart and into the middle of the room. "Here," she said. She'd come to Ridgecrest the way she'd come to the 2 hospitals before it, quietly, with a résumé that was correct in every detail and carefully constructed to reveal as little as possible. Her nursing credentials were current. Her references were real. The gap in her employment, 18 months, which was a long time, long enough that people noticed, was documented as a personal leave, which was accurate if incomplete. The hiring coordinator had been a young man named Theo who'd offered her a handshake and a coffee and a small speech about Ridgecrest's culture of collaboration, and she'd listened to all of it with the patience of someone who had sat through briefings in conditions considerably less comfortable than a carpeted HR office, and who understood that the content of what people said was often less important than what they weren't saying. "You'll start on floor rotation," Theo had told her. "Then Darlene will assess trauma floor access once she's had a chance to observe." She'd translated that too. "Darlene decides everything. Don't make noise." She'd been good at not making noise for a long time. It was a skill she'd cultivated deliberately, the way she'd cultivated other skills before it: field triage, tactical medicine, reading a room for threat before the threat announced itself. The noise reduction was newer. 2 years of deliberate practice. She'd gotten quite good at it. Darlene Mack had the look of a person who had confused authority with competence so thoroughly that the distinction had ceased to matter to her. She was 55 tall, with reading glasses she kept on a chain around her neck, and the kind of precision in her movements that came from years of running a high-volume department and being right often enough that being wrong had stopped feeling like a real possibility. She was not unkind exactly. She was the other thing, which was certain, and certainty in Simone's experience was the condition most likely to produce harm when it met something it hadn't accounted for. Beauchamp, Darlene had appeared at her elbow on her 4th day without looking up from her tablet. "Crash carts in bays 2 and 4 are below threshold. Check document flag anything critical." It wasn't a sentence, it was a dismissal wearing an assignment's clothes. "Of course," Simone said. She checked the crash carts. She also checked the medication log and found 3 discrepancies from the previous week. Not dangerous, but worth noting, and she wrote them up in detail and left the documentation where Darlene would find it. Darlene never mentioned it. That was week 1. By week 3, Simone had learned the department's rhythms well enough to move through them without friction. She knew which nurses worked which patterns. She knew that Dr. Sanderson was competent at the center of a crisis and dismissive at the edges of one. She knew that the young resident, Dr. Chen, was good with patients and uncertain with staff, and that the gap between those two things was exactly the kind of gap that systems learn to exploit. She knew that Darlene Mack's system was airtight when it was managing what it expected, and brittle when it met something it hadn't categorized yet. She knew these things because she'd been trained to know them, and because the training didn't stop just because she was carrying a clipboard instead of a med pack. She ran in the mornings on a route that took her along the river and then out toward the edge of the city where the prairie started and the sky got very big and very quiet. She had a therapist named Dr. Obi, who she saw every other Wednesday in an office that smelled like cedar and had a plant she'd been watching grow for 7 weeks, with something close to fondness. Obi was methodical and patient and didn't push, which was what she'd needed when she'd first arrived, and which was slowly becoming something slightly different from what she needed now, though she hadn't said that yet. What do you do when the noise starts? Obi had asked her once, early on. Name 5 things I can see, Simone had said, and if that doesn't reach it, she'd thought about it. I find the nearest exit and stand close to it, not to leave, just to know it's there. Obi had written something down. She hadn't asked what. The shift that introduced her to the problem was a Wednesday 6 weeks in. The patient was a 60-year-old woman named. She saw on the chart, Bertha Langille, elevated pressure, confusion, presenting symptoms that had been partially triaged before Simone came on shift. The issue wasn't the presenting symptoms. The issue was the medication list, which Simone caught while she was restocking the adjacent bay, and which showed a combination that 2 of the attending physicians had apparently approved without cross-referencing. She'd flagged it to the nurse assigned to the patient, a man named Travers, not a question, just a note. Just have you seen the interaction on the ACE inhibitor and the potassium supplement? Because the chart shows both at high doses, and that should probably be, I'll mention it to Dr. Sanderson, the nurse had said, in the tone of someone who was not going to mention it to Dr. Sanderson. She'd mentioned it herself, quietly at the edge of his awareness during a moment when the bay wasn't at full noise. Sanderson had turned to look at her with the expression she recognized. Who are you and why are you talking to me? The patient in Bay 3, she said, has a flagged interaction between, I'm aware of the patient's chart, he said, the ACE inhibitor, and I said I'm aware. He'd turned away. This is a supply issue? No, then it's not your concern. The patient's potassium had spiked 4 hours later. Not catastrophically, someone caught it in time, but it had required intervention, and the intervention had been harder than it needed to be, because the interaction had been ignored for the better part of an afternoon. Bertha Langille went home 2 days later, which was the outcome that mattered. But Simone had been in the supply room when she heard Sanderson tell a colleague that the spike had been unpredictable, and she'd stood very still for a long moment and then gone back to counting suture kits. Sanderson never mentioned the conversation. What happened over the following weeks was the particular kind of quiet punishment that didn't leave visible marks. The assignments that redirected. The sense that the air in a room shifted when she walked into it from an active case to something more peripheral. Darlene mentioning to her one morning that her integration into trauma rotation would be assessed at the 3-month mark, which was not what the original schedule had said. She didn't argue. She'd made a deal with herself. Small footprint, quiet life. Enough space from the noise to remember what it felt like to breathe at a normal rate. The apartment helped. The morning runs helped. Obi's cedar-smelling office helped. The fact that Lethbridge had views of the coulees and a particular quality of light in the late afternoon that she hadn't expected and found genuinely calming helped considerably. She was good at the deal. She'd had practice. The morning the soldiers came, she was restocking Bay 4, 7:40 a.m. The department was at about 60% capacity, which was what quiet looked like at Ridgecrest General on a Tuesday. She had a clipboard and a cart and was working through the inventory with the kind of methodical focus that people sometimes mistook for inattention. She heard it before anyone else. It wasn't that her hearing was better, it was that she was listening for a different set of signals than the rest of the staff, cataloging the world outside the building the way she'd learned to catalog it in places where the outside of the building was where things started going wrong. Multiple rotors, heavy, close, and coming in at an angle that was not a standard approach. She set down the clipboard. By the time the tactical units came through the ambulance bay doors, she was already positioned near the entrance to Bay 1 watching. 6 soldiers, 1 man on a gurney, compressions being performed in transit. Left side chest wound, she could read the dressing from across the room, soaked through, seal compromised, the particular posture of a body that was running out of time. Then, we're looking for Wren. They told us she'd be here. The room froze. She walked across it. Here, she said. The lead soldier, mid-40s, jaw like it had been made from something hard, the particular posture of someone accustomed to being the most competent person in difficult rooms, turned to her. Something shifted in his face that she recognized as recognition and relief arriving simultaneously. How long? She said. She was already reading the wound. 45 minutes since contact. Left side penetrating chest trauma. Tension pneumothorax developing, tracheal deviation starting, JVD visible. The seal was losing. He was decompensating in real time. Bay 1, she said, not to the soldier, to the room. To Darlene specifically, who had appeared from somewhere and was holding her tablet like a shield. Now, Darlene opened her mouth. He has less than 3 minutes on that tension. Simone said it evenly. Bay 1 now. There was a half second where the room held its breath. Then something moved. Priya, the younger nurse who'd been near the station, started toward Bay 1, and the soldiers moved with the gurney, and after a beat of absolute stillness, 2 other nurses followed, instinctively orienting toward what looked and sounded like authority in motion. She doesn't have clearance for active, Sanderson's voice from somewhere behind them. Move, the lead soldier said, not to Simone, to Sanderson. She heard Sanderson's footsteps stop. In Bay 1, she had 30 seconds to take stock. Priya at her left, already reading the tray. A senior nurse named Garrett, who had the face of someone who'd seen enough to function in a crisis. The soldier's med pack. Ridgecrest's trauma bay, which was well stocked because she'd been maintaining it for 7 weeks. 14 gauge, second intercostal, mid-clavicular, she said. Give me. Priya already had the tray. She placed the needle. The rush of air was audible. On the monitor, the saturation numbers stopped falling. Chest tube next, she said. Get me. Here, said Garrett, and he had it ready. She worked. Not fast in the way that looked impressive from the outside, not the performed urgency of someone who needed to be seen working, but fast in the way that mattered, which was sequenced and deliberate, and without the half-second gaps that came from uncertainty. She knew what the body was going to do before it did it. She'd seen this before in conditions where the closest help was an hour away and the decision was hers to make with whatever was in reach. Blood soaked through 2 pairs of gloves before the tube was seated. Breath sounds, she said. Priya put the stethoscope to his chest. Bilateral. The monitor changed. Saturation climbing. Heart rate still elevated, still wrong in several ways, but moving in the direction of survivable. The lead soldier was standing at the bay's edge. He hadn't entered, hadn't interfered. He'd done what people with good training did in crisis, identified the person handling it and stayed out of their way. When the numbers began to move, something shifted in his posture that had nothing to do with military bearing. He'll need surgery, Simone said. Get your best thoracic doctor. Anderson's been paged, said Priya. Simone kept her hands where they were and her eyes on the monitor, and she breathed slowly the way Obi had taught her, the way she'd been practicing for 2 years above a city that didn't know she was there. Outside the bay, she could hear Darlene's voice starting to organize itself into something institutional. The lead soldier's name was Cormac. He told her this in the hallway outside Bay 1 while Dr. Anderson's team took over the patient's transport to the OR. That's not my name anymore, she said, when he used the call sign. No, he said, but it was the only name anyone here was going to answer to. She looked at the door to the OR corridor. How did you find me? It took time, he said, with the particular economy of someone who'd practiced understatement. You covered your tracks well, but we weren't looking casually. Who is your team's forward medic 3 years ago? His replacement took a hit 6 weeks back on an extraction op. When things went sideways today, he requested you specifically. Cormac paused. He said there was one person he'd trust with this. His words. She thought about Reyes, about what Reyes had been like under pressure, the steadiness of him, the economy of motion, the way he never asked for anything he didn't need. She thought about the field in Manitoba where they'd worked a mass casualty event in 40 below wind chill, and he'd held a dressing in place for 14 minutes without complaint so she could work. He'll make it through the surgery, she said. Anderson is good. If what we bought him in that bay was enough to reach the table. It was, Cormac said. It was enough. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been working supply here? 7 weeks. He looked at her with an expression she knew, not judgment, something closer to grief at the edges. Let's find somewhere to sit, he said. They sat in the break room, at a table with a wobbly leg someone had tried to fix with a coaster and gotten wrong, and Cormac told her what she'd half known was coming, that the unit hadn't stopped looking, that her deliberate disappearing had been thorough but not thorough enough, that Reyes had been the one who filed the formal request, and that the formal request had triggered a search, and that the search had eventually led to a small hospital in southern Alberta where a very overqualified nurse had been restocking crash carts for 7 weeks. I know why you left, he said. I know you do. Nobody blamed you. I know that too. She looked at the wobbly table leg. Someone had tried electrical tape this time. It wasn't going to hold. I left because I needed to, not because of anyone else's opinion. The noise, yes. Is it quieter? She thought about the morning runs. Obi's office, the coolies in the evening light, the very specific piece of a supply cart she'd maintained so well that the department didn't notice it. Some days, she said, but you're hiding in supply rooms. That was the plan. He looked at her steadily the way Cormac always had, direct, without the social coding that most people applied to hard conversations. How's it going? She almost laughed. Apparently not as well as I thought. What she didn't know, sitting in that break room, was that three things were already happening simultaneously inside the building. The first was Garrett, 14 years at Ridgecrest, the institutional memory of a man who'd watched things accumulate in the space where a filing system should have been. He'd been in Bay 1. He'd watched her work, and something about what he'd seen, or possibly something about what he'd been watching for much longer than this morning, had clarified in him. He went to the administrator's assistant before Darlene finished her phone call. He asked for 10 minutes and got 15 because the assistant took one look at his expression and cleared the calendar. The second was the footage. Cormac's team had run helmet cameras, all 6 of them. That footage had been transmitting since the moment they'd landed. The Department of National Defense had a liaison protocol for military medical interventions in civilian facilities, and that protocol included automatic documentation to the hospital's compliance office, whether they requested it or not. Someone in compliance had watched 40 minutes of high-definition footage from 6 angles before Darlene finished speaking with legal. The third was Sanderson. Dr. Sanderson was not a man who revisited assessments. His professional identity had been built on a version of himself that was correct, authoritative, the person in the room who had the most relevant information at any given moment. That version had no error state. When error appeared anyway because reality was indifferent to professional identity, the system's response was to locate the error somewhere else, except that he'd stood at the door of Bay 1 and watched. He'd watched with the specific attention of a trained physician who understood what he was seeing. The decision tree behind each intervention. The speed that came from certainty, not adrenaline. The sequencing that was not improvisation but deep pattern, laid down in places where the nearest hospital was an hour out, and the choice was yours. He went to find Priya. He stood in front of her at the nurse's station with the expression of a man who'd misplaced something and couldn't determine where he'd last had it. "How long has Beauchamp been in supply rotation?" he said. "Since she arrived," Priya said, without looking up. 7 weeks. The pause that followed was the kind that contained a reckoning. He left without answering, which was itself a kind of answer. Dr. Fairmont found her 40 minutes later. He was Ridgecrest's chief of medicine, a man Simone had met once during onboarding and formed quick impressions of: careful, political, the kind of administrator who protected the institution first, because protecting the institution was how everything else got protected. Or that was the story he told himself. Not a bad man, just a man whose decisions emerged from a calculus that listed liability above almost everything else. He guided her to a consultation room and closed the door and sat across from her with the posture of a man who'd been doing necessary, uncomfortable things all afternoon. "I've reviewed the documentation from the Department of National Defense," he said, "and I've spoken with Garrett." She waited. "I'd like your consent to share a summary of your service record with hospital administration." He paused. "The relevant portions. The nature of your training, your qualifications, your operational experience is the complaint from Darlene moving forward," she said. He looked at the table. "That complaint is being reviewed." "How is it looking?" "It's looking," he said slowly, "like something that doesn't have legs." She thought about consent, about what it meant to let the carefully maintained opacity become transparent, about the apartment and the morning runs and Obi's cedar-smelling office and the 2 years she'd spent building a life that didn't ask anything of her that she couldn't give. The smaller life was already over. She'd known it the moment she'd walked out from behind the supply cart. "All right," she said. "Go ahead." Rise was awake when she reached recovery. He looked reduced, the particular diminishment of a large, capable person knocked horizontal by their own body, but his eyes were tracking, and when she came through the door, they found her immediately. "There she is," he said, in the rough post-anesthesia voice of someone surfacing from somewhere deep. "Here I am. Was it you? The Bay?" The surgery was Anderson. Before that, yes. He absorbed this, looked at the ceiling the way people looked at ceilings when they were organizing something. "I hear you've been working supply." "I have been supply." He said it with a particular inflection. "Simone Beauchamp, supply nurse." "I'm aware of how it sounds. You know what I kept thinking about?" On the bird going in and out, he stopped. The sentence was too long for where he was. "I kept thinking you were somewhere being something less than what you are. That felt wrong. It felt like waste." "You just had thoracic surgery," she said. "Save the speech. I prepared it in advance." 40 minutes in the air, his eyes closed, heavier now. "You're not going back to the supply cart. You don't get to decide that." "No," he agreed, already fading. "But something happened this morning that might." She sat with him until he was fully asleep. The room was quiet, in the specific way recovery rooms were quiet. She looked at the monitors. She thought about what he'd said. She thought about the supply cart and the 7 weeks and the particular architecture of a life built to fit inside the smallest possible space. She'd built it carefully. It had served a purpose. She needed the quiet, the bounded scale, the space to learn how to breathe at a different rate. She still needed some of those things, but survivable and livable weren't the same thing, and she'd been confusing them. Darlene was in Administrator Fairmont's office when Simone came back through the ER. The door was almost closed. She caught fragments, unauthorized, protocol, my department, liability exposure, in the particular elevated register of someone who had occupied authority for 9 years without being challenged in a way that required her to defend it. Cormac appeared at her shoulder. She's going to file something, Simone said. Let her. It's not your nursing license. No, he agreed. But your actual service record, the full version, requires a security clearance to read. Darlene Mack's clearance level is, he paused. She doesn't have one. If she files a formal request for documentation above her access level, she triggers a review process involving people significantly above this hospital's administrative structure. Simone stared at him. People, he continued, who are not going to look charitably at a charge nurse attempting to sanction a decorated field medic for saving a D&D priority asset. You prepared for Darlene. I prepared for the range of institutional responses to a military team entering a civilian ER. Darlene was the most likely outcome. His expression remained even. People who've operated from unchallenged authority for 9 years tend to escalate when the authority is challenged. It's predictable. The door to Fairmont's office opened. Darlene came out first. She was holding her tablet, and her face had the expression of someone who had lost an argument and was already mapping around it. She looked at the corridor. She looked at Simone. She looked at Cormac. Something moved across her face that Simone couldn't fully name. The cousin of embarrassment. The thing that happened when certainty met specific evidence that the ground was less solid than understood. She kept walking. Fairmont appeared in the doorway. He looked at Simone with the expression of a man recategorizing something in real time and finding it uncomfortable. Nurse Beauchamp, he said, I think we should discuss your placement going forward. Her pager went off, not her regular one, the emergency frequency. All available trauma staff to the bay. Mass casualty event, 3 incoming, ETA 5 minutes. The world held still for 1 second. Then she turned and ran. 3 vehicles, highway collision. Simone hit the bay doors moving and didn't stop. Priya was already pulling a crash cart. Garrett was on the phone, voice low and fast, calling backup from the floor above. 2 other nurses were setting up lines. Darlene was there. She'd gotten there first. Whatever else was true about Darlene Mack, she moved toward emergencies. She was at the center of the bay, directing with clipped efficiency, and when Simone came through the doors, she looked at her for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. Station 3, Darlene said, to the room. Not specifically to Simone, but not to her either. Simone went to Station 3. The first ambulance hit the bay at full pace. Highway MVA, truck versus passenger, multiple ejections, 1 pediatric driver presenting with altered LOC and abdominal rigidity. She was already reading the patient before the wheels locked. Male, mid-50s. The abdomen told the story, distended, rigid, the particular presentation of internal hemorrhage that meant the clock was already running. Abdomen, she said to the nurse across from her. Large bore IV, 2 sites. Onejik, and call surgery now. Anderson's still in the OR, Garrett said from across the bay. Who else? Dr. Mbeki. 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. She looked at the monitor. The pressure was dropping faster than the fluids were compensating. She looked at the patient, a man with a graying beard and someone's initials tattooed on his left forearm and a body that was making decisions she needed to interrupt. Get me a fast probe, she said. 4 views, 55 seconds. Free fluid around the liver, significant. Hepatic laceration, grade 3 or higher. He was bleeding into his abdomen and 20 minutes was not a number she could work with. Get Mbeki on the phone directly, she said, not the page. The second gurney came through, pediatric, a boy, maybe 10, with the gray stillness of a child whose body had absorbed more than it was designed to. He was breathing. She clocked that first, but altered, and the mechanism of injury suggested things less obvious than the visible injuries. Darlene was at that gurney. For a moment, across the noise and the motion, their eyes met. Darlene looked down at the child. Secondary trauma survey. Pediatric dosing on the board. She said it correctly. Quickly, her hands pointed in exactly the right direction. Simone filed on that and kept working. Her patient stabilized marginally on the fluids, enough for 4 minutes, not enough for 20. Mbeki was on the phone. She could hear Garrett giving the summary, and then Garrett at her elbow saying, Mbeki wants to know if you can hold him for 8 minutes. She looked at the monitor, at the man with the initials on his forearm. Tell Mbeki I'll try. The next 8 minutes were not the kind of medicine that translated well to any description. It was watching numbers and making adjustments and being wrong once, the pressure dropping faster than predicted, and correcting, and the correction working, barely, and the patient's body doing what bodies sometimes did when they were deciding, and her hands doing everything she knew to tip the decision toward the right answer. Mbeki came through the bay doors at the 8-minute mark. Early 40s, compact, moving with the practice speed of someone perpetually 40 seconds from where they needed to be. He looked at her patient. He looked at the ultrasound images. He looked at Simone. Good read, he said. Let's move. They moved the gurney at just below running. In the 3 seconds of the doorway, where the noise of the bay was behind her and the corridor's quieter urgency was ahead, she was aware of Darlene watching, not directing, not managing, just watching Simone move toward the elevator, toward the place that 7 weeks of supply rotation had been designed to keep her from reaching. She didn't stop to read Darlene's expression. She didn't have time. Upstairs, she gave the handoff report in the compressed shorthand of emergency medicine, and Mbeki listened without interrupting, and then he was through the OR doors, and she was standing in a corridor at 20 past noon, on a Tuesday that had started with a supply cart and a clipboard. She took the elevator back down. The department was quieting when she returned. The third patient from the collision had been stabilized and transferred to imaging. Priya was charting. Garrett was making coffee from grounds he'd brought from home, which explained why his always smelled better than the machines. The emails, Garrett said when she reached him. He handed her a cup without being asked. Darlene sent one to the whole charge team by mistake, 3 weeks ago. Wrong distribution list. She held the cup. What kind of email? The kind where she and Sanderson discussed keeping you on supply rotation indefinitely. Not as a probationary structure, as a... He paused, choosing the word carefully. Sanderson's word was containment, because you'd corrected him in front of staff. She went very still. I kept it, he said. I didn't know exactly what to do with it. This morning made it easier to decide. I sent it to the DND liaison before Cormac's team had been in the building an hour. She thought about Garrett. 14 years. The institutional memory of a man who'd been keeping a ledger in his head that nobody had ever asked to see, who'd had the chest tube ready before she asked for it. Thank you, she said. He poured his own cup. Better late than not at all. Fairmont held a staff meeting at end of shift. Most of the ER staff came. The ones whose shifts had ended stayed anyway. Darlene was not there. Sanderson was not there. Those absences said more than anything on the agenda. Fairmont stood at the front of the room with the posture of a man who had done necessary and uncomfortable things and was now on the other side of them. He spoke in the language of administrators, reviews, processes, the hospital's commitment to equitable practice, and the content mattered less than the fact of him standing there at all, saying it in front of the people who worked in this department. Midway through, he looked at Simone directly. The assignment structure for Nurse Beauchamp over the past 7 weeks did not reflect her qualifications, he said, and should have been reviewed sooner. That's a failure of oversight at several levels, including mine. Priya, 2 chairs down, exhaled audibly. Simone looked at the table and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said in this room that the morning hadn't already said. She found Darlene at the charge desk after the meeting. The tablet was there, a cardigan, a coffee mug someone had given as a gift. Darlene was packing these things into a bag with the careful, deliberate movements of a person doing a mundane task so they didn't have to think about what the task meant. Simone should have kept walking. There was nothing useful available in this moment, no sentence worth the energy it cost. She knew this about herself. She kept walking anyway. She was almost to the door when Darlene spoke. I thought I was protecting the department, she said. Her voice was level, not apologetic, not hard, not from you specifically, from an unknown quantity. Someone whose record had gaps I couldn't account for. You read my silence as confirmation, Simone said. I did. My silence was careful, not compliant. Darlene held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in her expression that had no clean name. The raw material of something that might, in time, become understanding. I know that now, she said. She picked up her bag and walked out through the ambulance bay doors. They closed behind her. Simone stood in the department she'd been stocking shelves in for 7 weeks and breathed slowly the way she'd been practicing. 1 month later, the formal commendation from the Department of National Defense arrived at Ridgecrest General, addressed to Simone Beauchamp, RN, citing her role in preserving the life of a priority military asset under time-critical conditions using improvised resources. Signed by a name several levels above anyone she'd spoken to directly. Fairmont had it framed. She hadn't asked him to. She found it on the wall near the charge desk on a Wednesday morning between the evacuation map and the ACLS algorithm poster. Plain wood frame. She stood in front of it for a moment. Priya appeared. He asked everyone. We all said yes. Everyone? A pause that contained 2 absences without naming them. Unanimous. She looked at her name in official type, on official letterhead, on the wall of the place where she'd once been asked to count gauze pads and stay out of active cases. She understood the smaller life now in a way she hadn't when she was inside it. She'd built it because she'd needed it. The morning runs, the quiet apartment, Obi's office, the particular piece of a bounded existence that didn't demand more than she had. That had been necessary. She didn't regret it. But she'd overstayed the necessity, and the shelter had started to become its own kind of enclosure. She wasn't the woman who'd walked in here with her history folded up and her whole self compressed into the smallest possible shape. She wasn't the call sign either. That version of her belonged to a context that no longer existed in quite the same way. She held it with respect and something close to tenderness and the understanding that what it had made her was not gone. Just part of a larger whole, she was Simone Beauchamp, RN, a nurse who had worked forward operating bases and mass casualty events, and a Tuesday in Lethbridge that had turned out to be all of the above. A woman who had flagged a medication interaction and been ignored for it, and who had kept showing up anyway because the showing up was the point, whether or not anyone was watching. The department was loud behind her. Monitors, the PA, Priya's voice fast and professional from Trauma 1, Garrett's good coffee already filling the break room with something better than what the machine produced. The ordinary machine of the place, grinding forward into another shift. She touched the frame once, briefly, and went to work. The chart at Station 1 was a man in his mid-40s, chest pain, diaphoretic, slightly embarrassed about being there, the way people were sometimes embarrassed about taking their own symptoms seriously. She read it in the 10 seconds it took to walk to him. When she pushed aside the curtain and he looked up at her with the particular expression of someone hoping to be told it was nothing, she looked back with the full and undivided attention of someone who had nothing else to be doing and nothing left to prove. "Tell me when it started," she said, and she listened.